No one imagined what the maid was doing, until the millionaire came home early and saw everything. He came home earlier than usual, and heard laughter coming from a forgotten room. Seeing his mute daughter smiling on the maid's shoulders, he felt more fear than relief. In a cruel impulse, he threw her out, not knowing he had just destroyed his daughter's only chance of healing.
The sun was setting over the London skyline, painting the skyscrapers golden, as Robert Sterling watched from the window of his penthouse office in the building that bore his name. At 45, Robert was one of the most successful businessmen in the country. His real estate empire stretched across several major UK cities, with luxury projects that attracted the nation's elite and foreign investors. From the 40th floor, he contemplated the city like someone observing a chessboard where every move had been meticulously calculated. His hands touched the tempered glass of the panoramic window as his secretary announced that the meeting with the shareholders had ended with unanimous approval for the new project in Cornwall. "Any other news, Patricia?" he asked, without shifting his gaze from the urban landscape. "You have a video conference with the investors from Dubai at 8, and your daughter." Nurse Marianne called to say that Juliet is still refusing to eat her dinner. A heavy silence settled over the room. Robert closed his eyes for a moment. He felt the familiar weight of those words, which he had heard almost daily for the last 2 years. Ever since Amanda, his wife, had passed away suddenly. From an aneurysm, Robert's world had been split in two. The financial empire that grew with each passing day, and the large house in Kensington, where his 7-year-old daughter lived in a silence that no specialist had managed to break. "Cancel the video conference. Tell them we'll reschedule for tomorrow," he ordered, grabbing his suit jacket. "But sir, the Arabs have waited 3 weeks for this." "Tomorrow, Patricia." The journey to his residence in the armored car took less than 30 minutes, enough time for Richard, his driver for over a decade, to notice his boss's even more somber expression. Kensington, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the capital, displayed its imposing mansions behind high walls and ancient trees. As he entered the gates of his property, Robert felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The house that had once been filled with the music Amanda played on the piano, and Juliet's laughter now seemed like a mausoleum of marble and crystal, an empty tribute to a happiness that no longer existed. He dismissed the driver with a discreet nod and entered through the side door, the one that gave direct access to the private wing of the residence. He preferred to avoid Mrs. Elmsworth, the housekeeper, who would surely bombard him with reports on Juliet's behavior, the medications she refused to take, and the recommendations of the new Swiss neurologist who had cost a fortune in video conference consultations. He climbed the stairs in silence, walking down the hallway that led to his daughter's room. He stopped before the half-open door, hesitating as he did every night. What would he say to the girl who wouldn't speak? How could he console this small being who, at 5 years old, had witnessed her mother collapse on the floor during an ordinary Sunday breakfast and had since retreated into a mutism that defied science? It was then that something unusual reached his ears, a sound so strange in that environment that for a moment he thought he was imagining it. A laugh, childlike, crystal clear, genuine. A laugh he hadn't heard in so long that his heart accelerated almost painfully. Robert followed the sound, which wasn't coming from Juliet's room, but from a room further down the hall, Amanda's old music room. The door was ajar, and through the crack he saw something that left him paralyzed. Juliet, his little Juliet, with brown hair and eyes identical to her mother's, was perched on the shoulders of a young woman he didn't immediately recognize. "Higher! I want to see the world from up here!" Juliet exclaimed, her voice sounding strange after so much time in silence. The young woman spun around the room, holding the girl's legs firmly while she stretched her arms as if she could touch the sky. Her curly hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a basic t-shirt and jeans, nothing that resembled the formal uniform he required of his staff. "Careful, little explorer. We're reaching the top of the mountain," the young woman said, pretending to climb an imaginary mountain range. Juliet laughed with abandon, her eyes shining in a way Robert thought was lost forever. Something inside him warmed, but it was soon suffocated by a wave of contradictory feelings: relief, hope, but also anger, jealousy, and above all, an irrational fear. How had this stranger achieved what the most renowned specialists in the world had not? Who was she to invade Amanda's sacred space, to touch his daughter in such an intimate way, to provoke laughter that not even he could elicit anymore? "What is going on in here?" Robert's voice came out louder and harsher than he intended. The young woman stopped abruptly. Juliet, still on her shoulders, went silent, as if a switch had been flipped. The smile vanished from her small face, replaced by the vacant expression that had become her norm. "Mr. Sterling, we were just—" "Who are you and who authorized you to enter this room?" He advanced, his eyes fixed on the employee who was now helping Juliet down from her shoulders. "This room has been closed for a long time." "I'm sorry, sir. I'm Grace Evans. I started today as a kitchen assistant. The little girl was in the garden alone and seemed sad. I tried to cheer her up and You ended up trespassing in a private area of the house, touching my late wife's belongings." Robert pointed to the grand piano that remained untouched in the center of the room. "Does Mrs. Elmsworth know about this?" The young woman swallowed hard, clearly intimidated by his coldness. "No, sir. It was my initiative. The girl became interested when I mentioned I knew how to play the piano and— You're fired." The words came out like blades of ice. "Get your things and leave immediately." Grace's face turned pale. Her deep brown eyes welled up with tears, but she maintained her posture. "Sir, please, I really need this job. I have 2 younger siblings to support and I'm not interested in your personal life. In this house there are clear rules about the areas permitted to staff and the proper handling of my daughter." He approached Juliet, who instinctively recoiled. "And you, young lady, you know you're not supposed to be with strangers without supervision." The girl looked down, returning to her cocoon of silence. Grace looked at the child with evident concern, then at Robert as if she wanted to say more, but the businessman had already taken Juliet by the hand. "Have the dignity to leave, without causing any more trouble," he finished. When Grace left the room crestfallen, Robert felt a pang in his chest as he saw the accusatory look Juliet gave him before pulling her hand away and running to her room. He stood there, alone in the music room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the distant echo of a laugh he had just silenced again. That night, as he tried to focus on financial reports in his home office, he couldn't shake the image of Juliet on that young woman's shoulders, laughing as he hadn't seen her do in so long. And he certainly couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that perhaps he had made a terrible mistake. In the days that followed, Robert noticed a drastic change in Juliet's behavior. The girl, who was already quiet, now refused to leave her room. She wouldn't accept food, ignored the expensive and sophisticated toys her father had delivered almost daily, and spent hours sitting on the windowsill, looking out at the garden as if waiting for someone. Mrs. Elmsworth, the housekeeper for nearly 2 decades, was the first to notice that Juliet constantly went to the door of the old music room, standing there as if waiting for permission to enter. When the pediatrician made his weekly visit and found that the girl had lost almost 2 kilos in a week, the alarm bells rang definitively. "You should have seen her," Mrs. Elmsworth reported to Robert as he nervously shuffled through a folder of documents in his home office. "She just sits there, staring at that door. Not even the cartoons she used to watch hold her interest." Robert closed his eyes, massaging his temples. The sleepless nights and worry were taking their toll. His empire continued to grow. The Dubai project had finally been approved, but his personal life was silently crumbling. "What did Dr. Maurice say exactly?" "That if she continues to refuse food, we'll have to consider hospitalization for intravenous hydration. But he warned that it could be traumatic and worsen her emotional state." The woman hesitated before continuing. "Sir, there's something I need to tell you. On the afternoon you fired, the new girl, Grace." Robert looked up, suddenly attentive. "What about her?" Juliet spoke. The words fell like stones in the silent room. "It was the first time in 2 years. She said clearly, 'I want to see the world from up here.'" A shiver ran down Robert's spine. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I tried, sir, but you were so absorbed in the negotiations with the foreign investors." A heavy silence fell between them. The realization of what he had done hit Robert with the force of a train. He had thrown out of his house the only person who had managed to make his daughter speak in 2 years. Out of pride, out of fear, out of an insecurity he didn't even fully understand. "I need to find her," he murmured, more to himself than to the housekeeper. "I believe I still have her hiring form in the employee files," Mrs. Elmsworth offered, a glimmer of hope in her aged eyes. The address led Robert to a reality completely different from his own. The outskirts of East London, in the borough of Stratford, showed the other side of the city he only knew through the windows of his armoured car. He asked Richard to park a few blocks away, ignoring the driver's concerned look. "Wait here," he ordered, dismissing the security guard who accompanied him. He walked through the narrow streets, observing the simple houses, some unfinished, others painted in vibrant colours that contrasted with the prevailing grey. Children played football in a makeshift field, and elderly women chatted on the sidewalks, looking with curiosity at the impeccably dressed man who seemed out of place in that setting. The address led him to a small house at the end of an alley. The walls needed painting, but the tiny front garden was well tended, with a few sunflowers growing in recycled cans. Robert hesitated before knocking on the simple wooden door. A boy of about 12 answered, looking at him with suspicion. "Can I help you?" The boy had the same deep brown eyes as Grace. "I'm looking for Grace Evans. Is she here?" "Who's asking for her?" The boy's protective stance was evident. "My name is Robert Sterling. I worked with her." A female voice came from inside the house. "It's all right, Peter. Let him in." The boy stepped aside reluctantly, and Robert entered a small but tidy living room. There were books stacked in a corner, open notebooks on a simple table, and a girl of about 8 sitting on the floor drawing. Grace appeared from a side hallway. She was wearing jeans and a King's College London t-shirt. Her expression was serious, a stark contrast to the playfulness she had shown while playing with Juliet. "Mr. Sterling, I must confess, I wasn't expecting to see you here." Robert felt uncomfortable for the first time in a long while. Here, in this simple environment, his power, his money, and his influence seemed insignificant before the dignity of this young woman. "We need to talk," he said, noticing that Peter and the little girl remained attentive to his every move. "Beatrice, Peter, could you give us a moment? B, finish your math homework in your room. Peter, check if the rice is ready." The children obeyed, but not without casting suspicious glances at the visitor. "Are they your siblings?" Robert asked, trying to break the ice. "Yes, I've been responsible for them since we were left on our own." She indicated a simple sofa but didn't sit down. "How can I help you, sir? If you've come to settle some employment matter, I should inform you that I only worked for 1 day and didn't even sign a contract." The polite coldness in her voice was a wall Robert knew he deserved. "I didn't come for that." He took a deep breath, a rare thing for a man accustomed to certainty in all his actions. "I came to apologize, and, if possible, to ask for your help." Grace crossed her arms, surprised, but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "My daughter, Juliet. Since you left, she has refused to eat, to participate in any activities. She spends all day staring at the door to the music room." "I'm very sorry to hear that," Grace replied, her sincerity evident. "Juliet is a special child. I noticed that the moment I saw her in the garden drawing by herself. Mrs. Elmsworth told me she spoke to you. It was the first time in 2 years, since her mother." Robert swallowed hard. "Since the incident." A flash of understanding crossed Grace's face. "I didn't know that. She seemed shy to me, but when I mentioned the piano, her eyes lit up. When I put her on my shoulders, she laughed like any child would. I didn't realize it was something extraordinary." Robert moved closer, his vulnerability apparent on his usually impassive face. "I need your help. I want to hire you again, not as a kitchen assistant, but to care for Juliet directly, as a special educator." Grace shook her head in disbelief. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your offer, but you humiliated me. You threw me out of your house as if I were a criminal, in front of an already traumatized child. Do you have any idea what impact that might have had on her?" The words hit Robert with surgical precision. He had never considered how his actions might have affected Juliet. He had always thought he was protecting her. "I am aware of the mistake I made, and I understand your mistrust. But I'm willing to offer terms that could benefit not only Juliet, but you and your siblings as well." "I'm not interested in charity," she replied firmly. "It's not charity. It's a professional proposal." Robert had never had to work so hard in a negotiation. You would be hired as a special educator with a commensurate salary. You would have the autonomy to develop activities with Juliet. Furthermore, I know you're studying education at King's College. I can guarantee a full scholarship for you to complete your studies and scholarships to good schools for your siblings. Grace watched him for a long moment, assessing his sincerity. "Why should I trust you?" "Because my daughter needs you, and for the first time in my life, I'm asking for help." The young woman glanced at a photo on the wall where she was pictured hugging her siblings. "I would have to set some conditions," she said finally. "First, respect. Never speak to me that way again, especially in front of Juliet. Second, the freedom to apply methods I deem appropriate without interference. Third, I want written guarantees about the scholarships. And fourth," she hesitated, "I need the flexibility to continue caring for my siblings." Robert felt immense relief. She was considering it. "All of those conditions are acceptable. I'm not promising miracles, sir. Selective mutism is complex and the bond I formed with Juliet is fragile. I may not achieve the same result again." "I'm willing to take that risk," he replied. When he finally returned to the car, where Richard was waiting patiently, Robert seemed different. There was a weight lifted from his shoulders and an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The next day, Juliet was in the garden, sitting in the same position as always, when she heard footsteps on the grass. As she turned her head, her eyes lit up momentarily upon recognizing Grace. The young woman smiled, kneeling to be at the girl's level. She said nothing, just held out her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Juliet took it. She didn't speak, but the hug she gave. Grace communicated more than any words could. From his office window, Robert watched the scene with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Something was changing in his house, in his life, and for the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to believe that the silence might finally be broken. Grace's first few weeks at the Sterling mansion were marked by small breakthroughs and considerable resistance. Juliet, after the initial hug in the garden, retreated again, as if testing the young educator's permanence in her life. She watched her from a distance, following her with her eyes through the rooms of the house but avoiding any physical or verbal contact. Grace didn't force any interaction. With a patience that impressed even Mrs. Elmsworth, she simply occupied spaces near the girl, reading books aloud in the garden while Juliet drew, playing simple melodies on the music room piano with the door open, or cultivating a small bed of colorful flowers she affectionately named the Garden of Words. "Every flower has its own time to bloom," Grace explained to Robert during one of the weekly meetings they had established to discuss Juliet's progress. "Some need more sun, others more shade. Some withstand the winter, others are more delicate." They were in his office, where the panoramic view of London contrasted with the intimacy of their conversation. Robert noticed how Grace seemed more confident each day, defending her methods with a serene conviction. "And what kind of flower do you believe Juliet is?" he asked, genuinely interested. "An orchid," she replied without hesitation. "Rare, resilient despite its apparent fragility, and it blossoms under very specific conditions." She smiled, adding, "But when it does bloom, it reveals an extraordinary beauty." That analogy stuck in Robert's mind for days. He, who had always measured success in numbers, profits, and expansions, was beginning to see his daughter through a different lens. In the 3rd week, during a rainy afternoon, the first major breakthrough occurred. Grace had built a blanket fort in the living room, with soft cushions and fairy lights creating a cozy atmosphere. Inside, she read stories of sea adventures, using different voices for each character. Juliet, who at first only watched from the entrance of the room, eventually snuck into the fort, sitting at a safe distance. And then the little lost octopus found a very wise turtle who told him, "To find your way back, "You must first find your voice," Grace narrated. "How?" The word escaped Juliet's lips almost like a whisper, so quiet that for a moment Grace thought she had imagined it. With her heart racing but maintaining an outward calm, Grace continued the story as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The turtle explained that at the bottom of the ocean there is a magic shell. Whoever finds it and whispers their greatest wish into it receives the courage needed to fulfill it. Juliet moved a little closer, her curiosity overcoming her apprehension. "And did the octopus find the shell?" Mrs. Elmsworth, who was passing through the hallway and heard the girl's voice, dropped the tray she was carrying. The noise startled Juliet, who immediately fell silent and shrank back. Grace gave the housekeeper a reassuring look, and she discreetly moved away, tears in her eyes. "I don't know," she finally answered Juliet's question. "The book doesn't tell us the ending. Maybe we can invent one together?" The girl didn't respond verbally, but she picked up a pencil and paper that Grace always left nearby and began to draw. By the end of the afternoon, she had created her version of the ending, the octopus finding the shell, a figure that looked like her mother beside it, and what appeared to be herself, Juliet, in the center of the picture. When Robert arrived home that night, he found the drawing carefully placed on his desk with a note from Grace. The orchid's first bud. Progress from that point on became more consistent. Juliet began to utter single words, then short phrases, usually during relaxed moments with Grace. The music room, once an untouchable shrine to Amanda's memory, gradually transformed into a space of life and learning, where Grace taught the girl basic notes. However, as Juliet blossomed, other complications arose in the house. Regina Scott, the head housekeeper hired after Amanda's passing, showed increasing coldness towards Grace. Small incidents began to occur, delayed meals for the educator, forgotten messages and sharp comments about certain people who don't know their place. She was always very close to Mrs. Elmsworth, who practically raised Juliet these last few years, Robert explained. When Grace mentioned the hostile environment during one of their talks, "She probably feels threatened by your success with the girl." "I'm not competing with anyone," Grace replied, clearly bothered. "I'm just doing my job." But it wasn't just Regina. One day Robert hosted Vincent Adler, his oldest business partner, for a meeting at home. The businessman, in his 60s, watched the interaction between Juliet and Grace in the garden with suspicion. "I'm worried about you, Robert," he commented, as they enjoyed coffee on the veranda. "This young woman, do you know where she comes from? What kind of influence she might have on Juliet?" Robert felt an immediate discomfort. "Grace is an education student at King's College, with excellent references. She's doing an exceptional job with my daughter." Vincent gave a condescending smile. "I don't doubt her technical qualifications, but let's be honest, she comes from a completely different world than ours. And she seems to be gaining considerable influence not just over Juliet, but over you as well." "What exactly are you insinuating, Vincent?" "Just that it would be wise to maintain a certain professional distance. Remember your position, the company's image." He lowered his voice, leaning in. "There are rumors at the club, you know how it is. Questions about this young woman of humble origins who is now living in the Sterling mansion." Robert felt his blood boil but maintained his composure. "I appreciate your concern, but my personal life and the decisions regarding my daughter's upbringing are not up for discussion." The tension from that conversation stayed with him for the rest of the day. That evening, while reviewing contracts in his office, he noticed Grace standing at the door. "May I come in?" she asked. Robert nodded, indicating the chair in front of him. He noticed she seemed worried. "Something happened today," Grace began. "I received a call from the school where my siblings started. Beatrice came home crying. Some classmates told her she didn't belong there, that she was a council estate kid on a scholarship." She took a deep breath before continuing. "Peter got into a fight defending his sister. He has a cut lip." Indignation was visible on Robert's face. "That's unacceptable. I'll speak with the school's headmaster immediately." "That's not all," she continued. "My neighbor, who has always been cordial, approached me aggressively yesterday, asking What kind of work I was doing to afford that expensive school for my siblings. The insinuations were degrading. Robert understood immediately. The rumors Vincent had mentioned had already spread beyond elite circles. Grace, I am so sorry. I never imagined that you and your family would be exposed to this kind of situation. Perhaps it was naive of me, she replied with a shadow of sadness. This arrangement is complicating our lives as much as it's helping. She hesitated before revealing, I'm wondering if it wouldn't be better to end this. Something inside Robert went cold. The thought of losing Grace, of seeing Juliet return to her silence, was unbearable. No, he said, with a firmness that surprised even himself. I will not allow ignorance and prejudice to determine my daughter's future, or yours. There must be a solution. They discussed alternatives for hours. In the end, they decided that Grace's siblings would be transferred to another excellent, yet more discreet institution, and that she would temporarily reduce her visits to Stratford, allowing the local gossip to die down. The next morning, Robert found Juliet and Grace in the Garden of Words. To his surprise, Juliet approached him with a drawing in her hand. "Daddy," she said, her voice small but clear, "look what I made." Robert's heart nearly stopped. It was the first time his daughter had called him that since the incident. The drawing showed 3 figures holding hands, a large one which seemed to be him, a small one in the middle, evidently Juliet, and a third. "It's Gabby," Juliet explained, pointing. "She's teaching us how to talk to the flowers." Robert looked at Grace, who was watching the scene with teary eyes. In that moment he understood that regardless of the external obstacles, something precious was blooming in his house, something that couldn't be measured or bought, something that for the first time in a long time felt like hope. Together the 3 of them planted a new seedling in the garden. "This one," said Grace, "is a special flower. It grows even when the wind is strong and the rain is heavy." "What's it called?" Juliet asked. Grace smiled, glancing briefly at Robert before answering, "A new beginning." Spring was ending in London, giving the first signs of the approaching winter. The Garden of Words that Grace and Juliet had planted was flourishing in vibrant colours, contrasting with the sky that was beginning to take on greyer tones. The Sterling mansion, once a monument to silence, was now gradually filled with Juliet's voice, which became more frequent and confident with each passing day. On a Saturday morning, Robert was preparing for a rare day off when his mobile phone rang. It was Richard, his driver, calling to say he was at Grace's house in Stratford to pick up Peter and Beatrice, as he did every weekend to bring them to the mansion. "Sir," Richard's voice sounded worried, "the children aren't here. The neighbour says they left yesterday afternoon with a man and haven't returned." An alarm went off in Robert's mind. Grace had mentioned the day before that her siblings would spend the weekend with her at the mansion, as they occasionally did since the gossip in Stratford had intensified. He tried calling Grace's mobile, but it went straight to voicemail. He went to her room in the staff wing, finding it empty. Finally, in Juliet's room, he found them both. His daughter was lying down, her face pale with a compress on her forehead, while Grace held her hand, humming softly. "What happened?" he asked, alarmed by both his daughter's condition and the news about Grace's siblings. Grace stood up, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "Juliet woke up with a high fever during the night. I called. Dr. Maurice, who diagnosed a respiratory infection, he prescribed antibiotics and complete rest." Robert approached the bed, touching his daughter's forehead. She was burning up. "Why didn't you wake me?" "I tried, but you didn't answer my knocks. Dr. Maurice said it wasn't a case for hospitalization, as long as we monitored the fever closely." Robert felt a pang of guilt. He had taken a sleeping pill the night before, after a particularly stressful week with the Dubai project. "Richard just called me. Your siblings aren't in Stratford." Grace's face transformed from concern to panic. "What do you mean? They were supposed to be at home waiting for Richard." "The neighbour said they left with a man yesterday." Grace turned pale. "My God, my ex-brother-in-law. He called last week saying he wanted to see the children, but I refused. Peter and Beatrice have hated him since he abandoned my sister when she was pregnant years ago." She grabbed her phone, dialing frantically. "I can't reach anyone. I need to go there now." I'm going with you, Robert decided immediately. Mrs. Elmsworth can look after Juliet for a few hours. Grace hesitated, looking at the sleeping girl. But she's so unwell. Juliet opened her eyes at that moment, her weak voice escaping her dry lips. Go get Peter and Bea, Gabby. I'll stay with Mrs. Elmsworth, and Daddy will be back soon. The exchange of glances among the three held an intimacy that surprised Robert. In just a few months they had formed a connection that transcended the traditional conventions between employer, employee, and child. After calling Mrs. Elmsworth and leaving detailed instructions, Robert and Grace left for Stratford. In the car the silence was heavy, laden with distinct but equally intense worries. Tell me about this ex-brother-in-law, Robert requested as Richard navigated the vehicle through London's busy streets. Marcus Oliver. He dated my sister Marianne for 3 years. When she got pregnant, he disappeared. He came back once when Beatrice was 6 months old, asking for money. Marianne was already sick then. Grace hesitated, the pain evident in her voice. When she passed away, he tried to claim custody of the children to get the small insurance policy she had left. The judge denied it and gave me permanent guardianship. Robert absorbed the information with a lump in his throat. There were so many parallels in their stories. Both had lost someone they loved. Both had become responsible for young children under traumatic circumstances. The difference was that Grace, with far fewer resources, demonstrated a strength and a capacity for love that he was still struggling to reclaim. When they arrived in Stratford, the neighborhood was already mobilized. Several people surrounded the car as soon as it parked, recognizing Grace. Mrs. Sedalia saw them leaving with Marcus, a middle-aged woman informed them. He said he had your permission to take the children for a trip to the shopping center. Marcus was never one for shopping trips, Grace replied, her voice trembling, with suppressed anger. Did he mention where they were going? He said something about visiting a friend in Luton, an elderly man who approached added. Peter didn't seem to want to go, but the man insisted it was a surprise for you. Robert, observing the interaction, noted how the entire community seemed to know and care for Grace and her siblings. It was a kind of connection he rarely saw in his own world of gated communities and strategic relationships. I have the address of the last place he lived in Luton, Grace said, already dialing the police, but he was always unstable, moved around constantly. After filing a report at the local police station, where Grace was treated with a familiarity that suggested previous visits related to her ex-brother-in-law, they headed to Luton. During the drive, Robert made several calls, mobilizing contacts in the civil police and even a high court judge who was a family friend. There's no need to bother so many people, Grace said, visibly uncomfortable with the influence Robert wielded. Yes, there is, he replied, with a determination that allowed no argument. Peter and Beatrice are important to you, therefore they are important to me. The look Grace gave him contained a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, which neither of them was ready to name. After hours of searching, they received a call from the police. Marcus had been located in a pub on the outskirts of Luton, drunk, while Peter and Beatrice were locked in the tiny room he rented in the back of a house. The children were frightened but physically unharmed. At the small police outpost where they were reunited, Beatrice ran into her sister's arms, sobbing, while Peter, trying to maintain a brave face at 12, had tears in his eyes. He said he was going to take us to live with him, Peter explained, sitting next to Robert while Grace comforted Beatrice. He said you had found a new family and didn't need us anymore. Robert felt a pang of guilt. In a way, he had taken Grace away from her siblings by demanding so much of her time at the mansion. Your sister would never abandon you, he assured the boy. You are her priority always. Peter looked at him with a maturity that was disconcerting for his age. I know, but since she started working for you, everything has changed. It's not her fault, she's doing the best she can. Those words weighed on Robert during the entire return journey to London. In the car, Beatrice fell asleep in Grace's lap, while Peter stared out the window, lost in thought. I can't leave them alone again, Grace murmured, more to herself than to Robert. Marcus is unstable, but persistent. If he did this once, he'll try again. Bring them to live at the mansion, Robert suggested. surprising even himself with the spontaneity of the offer. There are plenty of empty rooms and Juliet would love the company. Grace looked at him, hesitant. I can't mix things up even more. It's already difficult to maintain professional boundaries as it is. What boundaries, Grace? You are so much more than an employee in that house. You brought life back to my daughter, to me. He stopped, realizing how much he was revealing. Before they could continue the conversation, Robert's phone rang. It was Mrs. Elmsworth, her voice alarmed. Sir, you need to come back immediately. Juliet's fever has spiked. Dr. Maurice is here and is considering taking her to the hospital. Panic seized Robert. We're on our way, he replied, instructing Richard to speed up. When they arrived at the mansion, they found Juliet in bed, her breathing labored, her face flushed with fever. Dr. Maurice, a grey-haired man who had served the family for years, had a grave expression. The infection has spread to her lungs, he explained. We need to admit her to administer intravenous antibiotics and monitor her breathing. The next few hours were a blur of ambulances, hospital corridors and waiting rooms. Grace stayed with her siblings at the mansion under Mrs. Elmsworth's care while Robert accompanied Juliet to the hospital. It was past midnight when Robert, exhausted, saw Grace walk into the private hospital's waiting room. She had left her siblings sleeping and had come to offer support. How is she? She asked, sitting down beside him. Stabilized. The doctors say the fever should break by morning. Robert rubbed his tired eyes. I spent so much time building an empire, and in moments like this, none of it matters. Grace touched his arm gently. What matters is that you're here now. That's what Juliet will remember. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the exhaustion and emotions of the day weighing on them, both. I've thought a lot about your offer, Grace said finally, about Peter and Beatrice living at the mansion. And I accept on one condition. She looked directly into his eyes, that it's not a temporary solution. They need stability, to know they won't be cast aside if one day you decide you no longer need my services. The intensity of that gaze struck Robert deeply. I would never, he began, but stopped, understanding her fear. You have my word. Regardless of what happens between us, Peter and Beatrice will always have a home. Between us? Grace questioned, a slight tremor in her voice. Before Robert could elaborate on what he meant by those words, a doctor appeared informing them that Juliet had woken up and was asking for them both. In the hospital room, they found the girl pale but conscious. Her eyes lit up when she saw Grace. Did you find Peter and Bea? She asked in a weak voice. I did, little one. They're safe, and they send their love. Juliet smiled, then looked at her father. Did you help Gabby find them? I did, Princess, Robert replied, holding his daughter's small hand. So you're friends, now? The innocent question carried a weight that neither adult was prepared to address at that moment. Robert and Grace exchanged a long look, filled with unexpressed feelings. We are, Robert finally answered, without taking his eyes off Grace. We're much more than that. That night, as Juliet drifted back to sleep, Robert and Grace remained by her bedside in silence. Amidst the hospital machines and the soft sound of the girl's breathing, something was changing. Like a rare flower that chooses the most unlikely moment to bloom, a new feeling was growing between the thorns of the past and the uncertainties of the future. The London winter brought a new dynamic to the Sterling mansion. After 3 days in the hospital, Juliet returned home, where she was greeted with an impromptu party by Peter and Beatrice, who were already settling into the rooms adjacent to Grace's in the east wing of the residence. The children's presence transformed the atmosphere. Laughter echoed through the once silent corridors. Discussions about homework took place at the dinner table, and even Robert found himself involved in board games on Friday nights. Regina, the head housekeeper, observed this transformation with a mixture of disapproval and resignation. One morning, when she found Peter helping in the kitchen alongside Mrs. Elmsworth, she couldn't contain her discomfort. "The boy shouldn't be in here," she commented in a sharp voice. "The kitchen is no place for Miss Grace's children." Mrs. Elmsworth, who had developed an immediate affection for Grace's siblings, responded with unusual firmness. "Peter asked me to teach him how to make scones, and this kitchen is big enough for all of us." The comment reached Robert's ears, and he decided to have a definitive conversation with Regina. In his office, he explained that Peter and Beatrice were not temporary visitors, but new members of the household, and they were to be treated with the same respect afforded to any family member. "If that is not clear, Regina, perhaps it is time to reconsider your position in this house," he concluded, with a firmness that left no room for argument. The message was understood, and although the coldness remained, the derogatory comments ceased. However, external challenges continued. During a lunch at the country club frequented by London's elite, Vincent Adler made a point of approaching Robert when he was alone. "I heard you now have 3 protégés living in your house," he commented with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The young educator and her 2 siblings, a true work of charity." "It's not charity, Vincent," Robert replied, maintaining his calm. "It's humanity." Of course. The partner took a sip of his whiskey before continuing. "I just wonder how far this humanity goes. The Dubai investors are questioning your dedication to the new projects. 3 meetings postponed last month, decisions delayed." "I had a family emergency. My daughter was hospitalized." "Understandable. But now that she's well, I hope you'll go back to prioritizing what we've built together." Vincent lowered his voice. "Some shareholders are nervous, Robert. Talk about your involvement with an employee, about changes in your behavior. There are those who question if you're still the leader we need." Robert felt a restrained anger build inside him. For years he had sacrificed his personal life for that company. He had missed precious moments of Juliet's childhood, been absent when Amanda needed him most, all to build an empire that now felt like a golden cage. "I appreciate the concern," he finally responded, "but I suggest the shareholders focus on the financial results, which remain exceptional, and leave my personal life out of the boardroom." Returning home that afternoon, he found a scene that starkly contrasted with the tension at the club. In the garden, Peter was helping Juliet fly a kite, while Beatrice and Grace were picking flowers for an arrangement. The simplicity of that moment hit him like a revelation. That night, after the children were asleep, Robert invited Grace for a conversation on the veranda. The starry London sky, rarely visible due to pollution, seemed exceptionally clear. "I've been thinking," he began as they poured themselves some chamomile tea that Mrs. Elmsworth had prepared, "about the future." Grace looked at him with curiosity. In the past few months, since Juliet's hospitalization, something had changed between them. The initial formality had given way to a silent complicity, a mutual understanding that transcended words. "What kind of future? One where I don't spend 60 hours a week in meetings discussing how to make more profit, build more, expand more." He paused, contemplating the city lights in the distance. "A future where I'm present for Juliet, where I can actually watch her grow up." Grace smiled. "That sounds wonderful. Juliet would feel you're more constant present so much. It's not just for her." Robert looked directly into Grace's eyes. "It's for me, too. For the first time in years, I feel like there's something more important than the next big deal. And that's terrifying and liberating at the same time." "I understand perfectly." She hesitated before continuing. "Since my parents passed, and then my sister, I've lived only to ensure Peter and Beatrice had what they needed. My own dreams, my personal desires, everything took a back seat. But recently I've allowed myself to imagine other possibilities." The silence that followed was charged with meaning. They both felt the magnitude of the moment, the fragility of this new feeling growing between them. "I want to create an educational foundation," Robert said finally, "inspired by the methods you use with Juliet. Learning through affection, creative freedom, and respect for each child's individual pace." Grace's eyes shone with emotion. "That would be extraordinary. There are so many children who could benefit from that approach, especially in less privileged communities." "Exactly. And I wanted you to lead this project." Robert took a deep breath before continuing. "Which would mean a change in your role here. You would no longer be Juliet's educator, but a partner in this new venture." Grace seemed to process the information slowly, the implications of the proposal reverberating in her mind. "I'm finishing my degree next semester," she said finally. "I've always dreamed of applying what I've learned to transformative projects, but I never imagined having the opportunity so soon." "You more than deserve this opportunity, Grace. What you've done for Juliet, what you've done for me." Robert hesitated, the words feeling inadequate to express the depth of his feelings. At that moment, they were interrupted by a cry from Juliet's room. They both ran, immediately, finding the girl sitting up in bed, crying after a nightmare. "Mummy was trying to talk to me, but I couldn't hear her," she sobbed, as Grace hugged her. Robert sat on the edge of the bed, stroking his daughter's hair. "It was just a dream, Princess. Everything is okay now." Juliet looked at them both, her tears gradually subsiding. "Will you both stay here until I fall asleep?" Grace and Robert exchanged a knowing look. "We will," they answered in unison. When Juliet finally fell asleep again, they left the room quietly. In the hallway, Robert gently touched Grace's arm. "There's something else I need to say," he murmured. "Something I've been feeling for some time, but I didn't know how to express." Grace's heart quickened, but before Robert could continue, they heard raised voices from downstairs. As they descended, they found Peter arguing heatedly with Regina in the living room. "I didn't steal anything," the boy shouted, tears streaming down his usually composed face. "I've never taken anything that wasn't mine." Regina held up a gold and diamond brooch, a visibly valuable piece. "I found this under your bed during cleaning. This brooch belonged to the late Mrs. Sterling." Grace stepped forward, placing herself between her brother and the housekeeper. "Peter would never do that. There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Regina insisted. "The item was hidden among his belongings." Robert watched the scene carefully, noticing the genuine terror in the boy's eyes and the poorly concealed satisfaction on the housekeeper's face. He approached calmly, taking the brooch from Regina's hands. "This brooch," he said, examining the piece, "was a gift I gave Amanda on our 5th wedding anniversary. She rarely wore it. She found it too ostentatious." He looked directly at Regina. "How do you know it belonged to her when even I had forgotten its existence?" The housekeeper turned pale. She showed it to me once years ago." "I see." Robert turned to Juliet, who was watching the scene from the stairs with frightened eyes. "Juliet, darling, have you seen this brooch recently? Perhaps you went into Mrs. Scott's room to play?" The girl shook her head. "I've never seen that before, Daddy." Robert turned back to Regina, his voice calm but filled with authority. "It seems we have a mystery. Either the brooch walked by itself into Peter's room, or someone put it there. Either way, there will be no accusations without concrete proof in this house." Regina opened her mouth to protest, but Robert's gaze silenced her. "We will talk more calmly tomorrow. For now, we all need to rest." When the housekeeper withdrew, visibly disgruntled, Peter ran into his sister's arms, sobbing. "I swear, Gabby, I didn't take anything." "I know, my love," she assured him, holding him tightly. "We know." Robert knelt to be at the boy's eye level. "Peter, look at me. I trust you. No one in this house will be judged unfairly, do you understand? We will sort this out tomorrow." The look of gratitude Grace gave Robert in that moment contained a universe of emotions. When the children finally returned to their rooms, they remained in the living room, the tension from the incident still hanging in the air. "Regina is trying to drive you away," Robert concluded, "perhaps out of fear of losing her position, perhaps out of prejudice. Or both." "She won't be the first, nor the last," Grace replied with a tired sigh. "But I worry about the effect this has on the children, especially Peter. He already carries so much responsibility for his age." Robert walked to the window, observing the illuminated city. After a moment of reflection, he turned to her with renewed determination. "I will speak with Regina tomorrow. She will have two choices. Either she adapts to the new reality of this house, or she finds another position." He paused before continuing. "As for the foundation, and what I was about to say before we were interrupted." Grace moved closer, her heart racing. "Yes?" "All of that can wait until we resolve the current situation. The children's well-being comes first." Despite a slight disappointment, Grace smiled, recognizing, in that response, the man Robert was becoming. Someone who finally understood what truly mattered. The next morning, after a long conversation with Regina, Robert discovered the truth through the security camera footage. The housekeeper herself had planted the brooch in Peter's room. Confronted with the evidence, she confessed, claiming she only wanted to protect the Sterling family from opportunists. Her dismissal was immediate, and with it, the last major obstacle within the mansion was removed. Mrs. Elmsworth temporarily took over as head housekeeper, bringing a welcoming atmosphere that benefited everyone. In the weeks that followed, as preparations for the foundation moved forward, Robert made a decision that stunned the corporate world. He sold 40% of his stake in Sterling Enterprises, retaining only strategic control of specific areas. The news caused a stir among shareholders and made headlines in the financial papers. Vincent Adler was the first to show up at the mansion, incredulous at his old friend's decision. "You're throwing away a lifetime's work," he argued, as they walked through the garden. "And for what? To play philanthropist with a young woman you've known for less than a year?" Robert smiled, watching from a distance as Grace helped Juliet and Beatrice plant new flowers in the flower bed. "I'm not throwing anything away, Vincent. For the first time, I'm actually building something worthwhile." The old partner shook his head, resigned. "I don't recognize you anymore, Robert." "Funny," he replied, with a tranquility that was once foreign to him. "I feel like I'm finally recognizing myself." That afternoon, while preparing the final details of the foundation's project, Robert and Grace sat side by side in the library. The papers spread across the table contained the dreams they both shared: an educational center in Stratford, training programs for teachers, scholarships for children from disadvantaged communities. "Have you thought of a name for the foundation?" Grace asked, organizing the documents. Robert hesitated for only a second before replying, "The Amanda Sterling Foundation, to honor the past while we build the future." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "It's perfect." At that moment, Robert took her hand in his. "What I wanted to say before, that was interrupted that night." He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Grace, you brought more than just words back to this house. You brought hope, life, a meaning I had lost. And in the process, something happened. To me. To us." She interlaced her fingers with his, her eyes fixed on Robert's. "I feel it too. I don't want to rush anything. I don't want to confuse gratitude with something deeper." He smiled, revealing a vulnerability few had ever witnessed. "But I want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ready, there's a place for you not just in this foundation, in this house, but also in your heart," she completed with a shy smile. "Which is already occupied," he confirmed, "for longer than I even realized." 5 years had passed since that conversation in the library. The Amanda Sterling Foundation, initially a shared dream between Robert and Grace, had transformed into a reality that surpassed all expectations. What began as an educational centre in Stratford had expanded to 5 other units across London's outskirts, serving over 2,000 children, with the Learning with Affection methodology that Grace had developed during her work with Juliet. The old Sterling mansion had also undergone transformations. The garden, once restrained and formal, now occupied a large part of the grounds with themed flower beds cultivated by the children themselves. The music room, once an untouchable shrine to Amanda's memory, now vibrated daily with lessons for various instruments offered free of charge to talented young people from the community. On a sunny September morning, Juliet, now 12, was guiding a group of children through the garden paths. Her voice, once silenced by trauma, flowed with the confidence and gentleness of someone who had learned the value of every word. "This is the garden of words," she explained to the children who followed her attentively. "It was the first one we planted here. Each flower represents an important word that should grow inside us." A little girl of about 5, with colorful braids and lively eyes, raised her hand curiously. "Which words?" "Hope, courage, kindness." Juliet pointed to different flowers. And the most special one of all, right in the center. A new beginning. "What's a new beginning?" asked another little one, wearing the uniform of one of the Foundation's units. "It's when you get a chance to do everything differently, even after sad things happen." Juliet smiled, adjusting the small bundle she carried in her arms, a baby of just 3 months sleeping peacefully. "Like my little brother Michael, who brought a new joy to our family." On the other side of the garden, under the shade of an apple tree, Robert and Grace watched the scene with serenity. He, now with slightly graying temples, wore more casual clothes that contrasted with the impeccable suits of the past. She, with the same elegant simplicity as always, had in her eyes the sparkle of someone who had realized dreams bigger than she had ever imagined. "She has a natural gift for teaching," Grace commented, observing how Juliet captured the children's attention. "Just like her mother." Robert smiled, lacing his fingers with hers. The simple gold bands on their left hands reflected the sunlight. Amanda would be so proud of her, and of us. The path to that moment had not been without obstacles. The transformation of a professional relationship into something deeper had required time, respect for each other's grief, and the careful construction of new foundations. The prejudice of London's high society, though less vocal, remained a constant murmur at corporate and social events. Vincent Adler still cast disapproving glances when they met, never fully convinced that Robert hadn't thrown away his career for a romance. But the life they had built together was worth every challenge faced. Peter, now 17, was preparing for his entrance exams for environmental engineering at Imperial College London, with plans to develop sustainable projects for the communities served by the Foundation. Beatrice, at 13, showed exceptional musical talent and led a children's choir at the Cultural Centre that operated in the west wing of the mansion. "The opening ceremony for the new unit in Peckham is confirmed for next month," Robert commented, discreetly checking his phone. "The Secretary of State for Education has confirmed his attendance." Grace nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the children, especially Juliet. "She's made so much progress. Robert, remember how worried we were when we announced our marriage? The fear that she would interpret it as a replacement, as a betrayal of her mother's memory?" "And she surprised us, as always," he completed, recalling the moment 3 years earlier when they had sat down with Juliet to explain their decision to formalize their relationship. The girl, then 9, had listened attentively before asking, with the disarming wisdom she sometimes displayed, "Does this mean Gabby is going to be my mum too?" "If you want her to be," Grace had answered cautiously. "But no one will ever replace your mother, Juliet. She will always be unique in your heart and in your father's heart." To their surprise, Juliet had smiled serenely. "I know. Mummy taught me how to live, but you were the one who taught me how to speak again." And then, with moving naturalness, she had added, "I can have 2 mums, can't I? One who gave me life and one who taught me how to live after I got sad." Those words, in the profound innocence of a child, had dissolved the last vestiges of guilt that Robert carried. The wedding, held in the mansion's garden a few months later, had been an intimate celebration, focused on the union not just of 2 people, but of 2 families that fate had unexpectedly intertwined. Adapting to the new family dynamic had not been without adjustments. Peter, initially the most reserved about his sister's relationship with Robert, gradually developed a relationship of mutual respect with him, especially after the businessman dedicated time to helping him with school projects and encouraging him to follow his own dreams without imposition. When Michael was born 9 months ago, the family finally felt complete. The baby, with Grace's dark eyes and Robert's already recognizable smile, had become the center of attention, adored especially by Juliet, who had taken on the role of older sister with moving dedication. "Auntie Elmsworth is calling for lunch." Beatrice's voice interrupted the couple's reflections. The teenager ran towards them, her curly hair tied back in a ponytail dancing in the wind. "She made a full roast because Peter aced his mock exams." Grace smiled, getting up. "Let's go then. We can't keep Auntie Elmsworth waiting. She hates it when the food gets cold." Mrs. Elmsworth, who at 70 steadfastly refused to retire, had transformed from housekeeper to the family's official auntie, treated with the same affection and respect as a grandmother. Her Sunday roasts had become a tradition, bringing together not only the family, but often teachers from the foundation and the children's friends. As they walked towards the house, Juliet approached with the baby in her arms, now awake and smiling. "I think Michael is hungry," she said, handing her little brother to Grace. "Thank you for looking after him during the tour," Grace replied, kissing her stepdaughter's forehead. "You're a wonderful sister." "I learned from the best," Juliet smiled, casting a meaningful glance at Peter, who was approaching with a book under his arm. During lunch, the bountiful table was a hub of stories and projects. Peter animatedly discussed renewable energy for disadvantaged communities with Robert, while Beatrice tried to convince Mrs. Elmsworth to teach her the secret recipe for her special gravy. "Speaking of recipes," Grace commented, after serving a generous portion to one of the invited teachers, "I received an interesting email from the University of Edinburgh. They want me to present our methodology at a national symposium on inclusive education." Robert looked at her with pride. "That's wonderful, Gabby. Your work deserves that recognition." "It's not just my work," she replied, humble as ever. "It's ours, all of ours." Juliet, who was listening intently to the conversation, chimed in enthusiastically. "Can we all go? I've never been to Edinburgh." "And they have a castle," added Beatrice, already daydreaming. Robert laughed at the girl's excitement. "We can turn it into a family trip, why not? Michael is old enough to travel, and the school holidays are coming up." The plan was met with general approval, and soon the conversation drifted to travel itineraries and possible activities. This ease of making plans together, of sharing dreams big and small, was a luxury Robert had learned to value more than any material possession he had ever owned. After lunch, while Mrs. Elmsworth organized the kitchen with Beatrice's help, and Peter took some of the teachers to see his rainwater harvesting project at the back of the property, Robert, Grace, and Juliet returned to the garden. Michael slept peacefully in his mother's arms, rocked by the gentle breeze of that spring afternoon. "Remember when we planted this rose bush, Daddy?" Juliet asked, pointing to a white rose blooming alone in a special flower bed. "I remember. Princess, it was on the 5th anniversary of your mother's passing. And this other one, the red one we planted when you and Gabby got married," she continued, gently touching the petals of the neighboring flower. "They're different, but they go well together, don't they?" Grace felt her eyes well up at the girl's observation. "They go perfectly together, my love." Juliet smiled, satisfied with the answer. "I have an idea for the next flower bed. Can we plant a rose bush for each person in the family? A white one for Mummy Amanda, a red one for you two, a yellow one for Michael, and others for me, Peter, and Bea." "A family garden," Robert agreed, putting his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "I think that's a perfect idea." At that moment, a group of neighborhood children who participated in the foundation's activities ran past, their laughter echoing in the afternoon air. One of them, a girl of about 7 with long braids, stopped briefly before them. "Miss Grace, Mr. Paul said we'll have a music class in the gazebo tomorrow. Is that true?" "It's true, Clara," Grace confirmed with a smile. "And you can bring your little brother too. We're starting a class for beginners." The girl thanked her with a radiant smile before running to catch up with her friends. Juliet watched the scene with interest. "She reminds me of me when you first came, Gabby. Always quiet, watching everything." "And look at you now, how you talk," Grace replied, stroking her stepdaughter's hair. "Sometimes we just need the right person to help us find our voice." Juliet nodded thoughtfully. "Did you know I still remember that day? When I climbed on your shoulders and asked to see the world from up here?" Robert and Grace exchanged surprised looks. It was rare for Juliet to spontaneously mention that early period. "I remember it was the first time in a long time that I felt like talking," she continued. "It was as if something that was trapped in here," she touched her own chest, "found a way out." Grace handed the sleeping baby to Robert and knelt to be at Juliet's level. "Do you know what made me come back to this house, even after what happened that day?" The girl shook her head, curious. "Your drawing. The one with 2 mothers and the garden where you wrote, 'It's you I talk to.' At that moment, I knew I had to try, that there was something special between us. Juliet hugged Grace impulsively, and I was right. It's you I talk to, and Daddy and Peter and Bea, and now Michael too. When they pulled away from the hug, Grace noticed Robert watching them with teary eyes, the baby nestled against his chest. She approached him, forming a family circle right there, among the flowers. "I think we did it, didn't we?" Robert murmured, his voice thick with contained emotion. "We built something worthwhile." "More than worthwhile," Grace replied, looking around, at the flourishing garden, at the house that now radiated life, at the children playing in the distance, at the family they had formed. "We built a new beginning." On the horizon, the sun began its slow descent, painting the London sky with orange hues that were rarely appreciated in the rush of the metropolis. The family remained there in comfortable silence, each immersed in their own thoughts, but connected by bonds that transcended blood, past, or social conventions. Little Michael woke at that moment, opening his eyes to the world as if seeing it for the first time. His curious gaze traveled from his father's face to his mother's and his sister's, before breaking into a toothless grin that lit up everyone around him. "Look, he's smiling!" Juliet exclaimed, delighted. "It's the first time he's smiled like that, so openly," Grace observed, moved. Robert contemplated his youngest son, then his wife and his eldest daughter, feeling a completeness he had never imagined possible in the dark days after Amanda's passing. "Maybe he's telling us he approves of our family garden," he suggested with a serene smile. "Or maybe," Grace replied, "he's just reminding us that sometimes the strongest love is the one that blossoms from the rubble, and that true repentance is revealed not in tears, but in actions." Juliet, with the wisdom that often surprised the adults, completed the thought. "Like the flowers in our garden, right? Some pains don't disappear," she looked at Amanda's white rose, "but some loves transform them into something beautiful." The family stayed in the garden until the sun had completely set, intertwined not just by physical hugs, but by the deep understanding that they had each, in their own way, found the true meaning of a new beginning, and that together, like the different flowers in that garden, they formed an arrangement whose beauty lay precisely in the diversity of their origins and the harmony of their shared growth. When the first stars began to dot the London sky, they returned to the illuminated house, where Mrs. Elmsworth, Peter, and Beatrice awaited them with hot tea and fresh scones. The sweet, cozy aroma filled the air, mingling with the laughter and conversations that echoed through the once silent rooms. It was just another evening in the life they had built together, a life where the past was not forgotten but honored, where differences did not divide but enriched, and where every day with its joys and challenges was a new chance to cultivate the garden of new beginnings that flourished not only around the house, but within each of them. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the journey of Robert, Grace, and Juliet has touched your hearts, showing that even in the most difficult times, a new beginning is possible when we open ourselves up to new affections. If you were moved by this story of resilience and love, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who also needs a little hope. In the playlist to the side, you'll find other equally engaging narratives about fresh starts and second chances. And in the comments, tell us, what moment in this story touched your heart the most? We look forward to reading your thoughts and continuing to share stories that make a difference. Until next time.